Just some quick background here. I'm a 28-year-old female and I'm a dog walker / pet sitter. Some of the dogs that I walk have reactivity, as did this one dog, a pit lab mix. She used to be a really bad puller, along with being incredibly reactive to other dogs on leash as soon as she'd see them. Though through lots of hard work and training with her, she's come a long way with her reactivity to the point it really isn't an issue anymore, even when other owners' carelessness allows their dog to get too close for comfort. On this one walk, she was a dream the whole time. She passed multiple dogs without any issue. She would just look at me for her treat she knew she'd get if she was good. We turned down a side street that looked completely vacant at the time, so I could give her some more relaxed walking time, and all went well for a while. Not a soul in sight, until there was. While I'm usually very good at keeping my head on a swivel, as some of my walks are not in the safest parts of the city, this guy took me by surprise. I don't know how he did it, but he got about 2 or 3 feet behind us without my dog or me knowing he was even there, and all of a sudden shouted something unintelligibly. I could only make out the last 2 words though. Your dog. Immediately, my dog, with no prior history of human reactivity, got between us and started growling, snapping, and lunging aggressively at this man. I'm a smaller woman at 5'3", and I'd guess this guy was about 6'7" at the very least, and incredibly muscular. As soon as he saw my dog trying to attack him, and me struggling to hold her back, he threw his arms up and bolted across the street without another word, disappearing shortly after around a corner. I've never praised a dog for reactivity until that moment. I gave her all the treats I had left in my pocket, and I took her home and told her owner what had just happened and how her dog might have just saved my life. Of course, I hope I'm wrong and that the guy was just slow with social cues, but neither the dog nor I got that impression. Needless to say, she's by far my favorite client dog. I go on walks with her still every week, but we haven't gone down that street again while there's no people about. I'm beyond blessed to have her and get to walk with her weekly, but I do hope I never meet the "your dog" guy ever again. I usually get over creepy encounters fairly quickly, but this one was quite different from the rest. I go by the rule, be nice to everyone because you never know who could be a secret serial killer, and that's worked out well for me the majority of the time. Although this time, it was probably what got me into this situation. When I was 18, I worked as a lifeguard by a small pool. Nothing fancy, I was basically just a babysitter to all ages. When adults got bored looking after their kids, they sometimes sought me out for some reason to have a free therapy session. Mothers and fathers talking about their hardships. I know I worked as a lifeguard, but I can't save that kind of life. One day, a 50-year-old man with his 2 kids came to the pool. As many other people did, he went up to me and started talking. It started with some small talk, like how he didn't let his children eat ketchup because it has the same properties to remove even rust from metals. But as the hours went by, he started talking badly about one of his kids. How she was overweight, had anger issues, and was, quote, worried about boys when no one would ever look at her. I'm not gonna lie, that last statement made me go quiet, and I tried to somewhat reason with him to not speak like that about his daughter. He seemed to listen to what I had to say, so I was happy that I could possibly help his kid in some way. Having a parent like that would have given anyone a hard time. The next day he came back, extremely happy, telling me that I was, quote, so good with kids, because my talk had apparently helped him. He then began the day by trash-talking his ex-wife to oblivion, like how she had the most custody over their kids, and that the kids only ate fast food at her house. I didn't say much because I felt like it wasn't my place to speak, and I didn't want to create any unnecessary drama at the workplace. But what set the first red flag in motion was when the conversation suddenly shifted into him wanting a, quote, young wife. It was as if he tried to trash-talk his ex to get me to understand that he was single, and that he was interested in a relationship with me. The days went by and he continued to visit the pool every day. To some extent, I had the feeling that he now came every day just to see me. I was fairly creeped out by this thought, so I tried to ignore it and just do my work. As the days passed, he started asking more and more personal questions like, where do you usually go grocery shopping? And, is there a cafe close to where you live? As I was fairly sure he was trying to figure out where I lived, I kindly deflected all of his questions with something very obscure. During my last work week, I had an afternoon shift. I asked my colleague who had the morning shift if anything had happened that day that I should be aware of. He told me that they had to ban a man from entering the pool area because he had reached behind the counter at the small pool shop where the workers keep their personal things. Apparently, he had been denied by my coworker to get a look at our work calendar, so he had tried to get a glance at it in a more illegal manner. That last week, I saw him twice at the end of my shifts, standing near the pool entrance. The second time I saw him there, I reported him to the pool security guards, and after that, I never saw him again. I lived in a small suburbanish area of a small town. My house was very close to my grandparents' house. It went my house was on one block, a large church with a large parking lot was the entirety of the next block, and then the block of my grandparents' house. My grandparents were both retired, and so every day during the summer while our parents were at work, a few of my cousins and I would spend the day at my grandparents'. Honestly, it was such a fun childhood to have. When I was around 11, my parents bought us a dog. One of my chores during the summer was to walk over to my house and let the dog out to use the bathroom, and then walk back to my grandparents'. One of my cousins who was a year older than me would always go with me too. Well, one day we were on our way back to my grandparents', and a guy drove up next to us. In one quick motion, he opened his car door and yelled, "Gotcha!" At that moment, my cousin and I just took off running. He quickly shut his door and sped ahead of us into the parking lot of the church. Instead of running through the parking lot, my cousin and I ran behind the church, but continued in the direction of my grandparents'. When we emerged from the backside of the church, the guy was still in the parking lot, his head on a swivel looking for us. We continued to run. A few heartbeats later, he spotted us, and we heard his tires squeal again after us. Thankfully, we were very close to my grandparents and quickly made it inside. We ran in and told my grandmother, who of course didn't believe us, and told us to go back outside and play. So, we did as we were told, and my cousin and I did go back outside. Still spooked, neither of us felt like playing and just sat on the front porch. Soon, the guy drove back and slowed down as he passed. We ran back in and told my grandmother, who again didn't believe us and told us to go back outside. Well, the third time of us coming in and interrupting her soap opera, she finally came out on the porch, and at the same time the guy passed by again. She called the police, and while we were talking with the police officer, the guy drove by again and we pointed him out, but the police officer just took our statements and left. We never saw that guy again. I would like to think that the police officer pulled him over and scared him into not bothering us or anyone else again, but I highly doubt it. I'm a 21-year-old female and I live with my grandparents in a large city on a busy road. I was just in bed when I heard the doorbell ring, and I was about to answer it, but my grandpa got to the door before me. I'm now so glad that he did. I couldn't see the front door from the hallway, but when he opened it, I heard a woman say, "Hi, my name is Taylor. I think I know you." I didn't recognize that name, and my grandpa didn't either, because he told her that he definitely didn't know her. He asked how he could help her, and I heard him open the door wider, and then her quick footsteps as she just ran away. After she left, I came out to ask my grandpa what happened. He told me about the interaction with a puzzled look, and I immediately recognized it as suspicious. We have a Ring doorbell, so we pulled up the video it had taken. It showed a young woman covered in tattoos approaching our yard. As she walks up, she whistles loudly to someone off camera. I watch as my grandpa opens the door and she says that she thinks she knows him. Now, my grandpa is a retired police officer, and tonight he happened to be wearing his t-shirt with the name of our city's police department. When he opened the door wider, she must have noticed his shirt because her eyes widened and she just runs away. I watch as the video shows her holding up her arms crossed in an X as she runs away, and a few seconds later a man crawls out from behind my car parked outside and follows her. Then the woman can be heard whistling again as they walk down the block. My grandpa called the non-emergency police line to report suspicious activity, and 2 officers arrived 15 minutes later to hear out our statements and watch the video. They seemed to agree that these were probably 2 addicts working together, casing out the neighborhood to see which houses they could break into. Since there was no proof of a crime committed, the officers gave us an email to send the video to and left. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I, a 5'3", 100-pound, 21-year-old young woman had been the one to answer the door, instead of my grandpa, who was a 6'2", ex-military retired police officer. So, sketchy couple lurking around my neighborhood? Let's not meet. About 3 years ago, I, a 21-year-old female, was a waitress during the height of COVID. It was my first ever job, and I remember being so excited to start as soon as possible. After all my training was finished and I got my certifications, I was put on the closing shift. We closed at 10 p.m. every night at the time, and typically it was just my cook, a 20-something-year-old male, and I. Rarely would there be another waitress with me, and I liked it that way. I always worked better alone, and I didn't really get along with most of the other waitresses anyway, so it was nice. I can remember that it was near the end of my time there that this experience happened, and I'm really happy I had the circumstance that I did at the time. I never could really trust my gut that much, because I had mild anxiety and couldn't tell if what I was feeling half the time was valid or not. I mention this because when it all went down, it felt real, and I had an absolute feeling. I had started my shift that evening around 3 p.m. I said goodbye to the last waitress, and I was on my own with the cook. Everything was pretty slow and normal until I got a call about one of the specialty items on the limited time menu we had. The food couldn't be ordered as takeout, and the lady over the phone really didn't take it well. After a little debating, she finally decided to sit in and eat instead. I'd say around 10 to 20 minutes later is when I spotted an older-looking car pull up and 3 people came out. 2 men and a woman who looked to be in their 30s to 40s. I could tell it was the same lady I spoke to over the phone, judging by her attitude coming in. I further confirmed this by asking, since I already had a pretty good idea of what she wanted to eat. What I thought was an act of mild embarrassment and pettiness was actually something much more sinister later on. Her attitude toward me changed when she saw me. She was much nicer and more cooperative. This didn't ring any bells at first because it was something that most people who wanted to look good in front of others would do. I set them at a booth and took their orders. I noticed that they had a red binder and a black pin. Remember this. I then went to tend to my other customers as there was a couple other tables I was waiting on. Once I brought out their food to them, they asked me if I knew any realtors. I actually found this to be normal, as this being the tourist vacation state that it is, it wasn't uncommon for outsiders to be looking for getaway homes. I would say this was reasonable for me to assume it was nothing, if they didn't already look like the unsavory type of people, if you get what I mean. Nonetheless, I gave them the phone number of a realtor I knew closely and well, since I often went to church with her. There wasn't any other notable interactions I really had, aside from occasional small talk if I wasn't doing anything or refilling their drinks. It was around 4:30 p.m. now, and they were the last of my tables to leave the restaurant. If any of you were in the food industry, you would know that as a server, you don't really get breaks, just a lunchtime most of the time, and sometimes not even that if it's super busy all day. So my cook and I took this as an opportunity to take a well-deserved break. We walked out behind them and had a small chat with them. I should mention by now that the front of the restaurant had a disabled ramp coming up to the doors. It was long because the building was on a raised foundation. This is important. Now, I didn't really notice this at the time, but one of the men took my cook to the other side of the ramp, down near the end, and was chatting with him over a cigarette. I was behind the railing at the top of the platform where the ramp plateaued. Luckily, the other man and the woman were on the other side of the railing about 5 feet below, but in front of me. We were having some small talk, and they started to ask me some personal questions, such as if I lived in the area, if I smoked weed, how old I was, etc. I hadn't quite learned yet that telling strangers such personal things wasn't a good idea. However, this, for some reason, was starting to raise some red flags. I gave very vague answers to all of her questions as best as I could. Unfortunately, they still persisted in trying to have some sort of communication with me outside of my work, whether or not I said no. I suppose when they finally realized that I wasn't going to give that information up, the woman finally got to her point. She had told me that she had a business offer for me. It was for a cleaning service. I don't like cleaning anyway, so regardless I would have said no. However, what she said next solidified my answer. She proceeded to tell me that she owned a maid service called the Pretty Kitties Maid Service. She said she needed pretty and young girls like me, that she had 10 girls now as it was, and she wanted to expand. She mentioned how they get paid $30K, she didn't specify the time length, and how it would be a great opportunity for me to help with her business. I instantly knew at that point that it certainly wasn't a maid service and I was in danger. However, I didn't understand just how much danger I was in. I politely declined her offer and told her I liked my job as it was, that I was satisfied working for my boss. She tried to further convince me by telling me how easy it was and reiterating how much I'd make under her supervision. She mentioned how she had a van for her business and described it to me. I can't exactly remember what she told me, but I do remember how she told me to follow her to her car. She said she'd show me a picture of her van in her car, but her phone was in her hands. I knew for certain I wasn't going anywhere with her or near that car. I declined yet again and said I was fine right where I was. I said that she could show me on her phone instead, but she was hesitant, after which she proceeded to end the conversation and left with the two men. A little shaken, I walked back into the restaurant with my cook and told him what I had just experienced. He joked about how I'd have good money if I went with them. Because I didn't take the situation as seriously as I should have, I laughed with him. At the end of the night, when the cook's grandmother came to pick us up, I mentioned the weird interaction to her. A panicked look came over her and she just sat there silent, staring at me. I got confused and asked her if everything was okay. That's when I learned the signs of human trafficking. She broke it to me that I was almost trafficked and I was incredibly lucky I didn't get kidnapped. My stomach dropped and I started to panic at the realization of just how much danger I was in. Nothing really happened after that, except for the red binder and the black pin I told you to remember. I went to work the next day and a customer walked in. Now, normally in my part of town, not many people like to sit and relax for a while. They're mostly there to just eat and leave, as it wasn't exactly a cafe. Well, I get into my apron and sit this gentleman down. He was well dressed, not in a suit or tie, but just nicely dressed. He was alone, too. I sat him at a single booth and took his order of one single coffee. He had a red binder and a black pin with him. I didn't even notice until my cook from the night before reminded me of it. I was so shocked at the fact, and it unsettled me even more, that he proceeded to sit there for 3 hours, watching me as I tended to my tables. I kept asking him if he needed anything else, and he asked me if people never just sat there and relaxed with coffee. I sort of shrugged and said, no, not here. Now, this might come as a surprise to some of you, but servers, believe it or not, do listen in on some of your conversations. I'm lucky I did with this one. I specifically remember him speaking over the phone about finances and how he needed to find another house. He spoke about moving money and how it was going to pay his girls that night. I ran to the back of the kitchen and told my cook. Thankfully, he came out with me to, quote, help deliver some plates in order to throw the guy off. It worked, I think. He ended up leaving not long after that, and I haven't seen or heard anything since. I'll tell you though, I've been much more on guard since then. I just read another story on here about somebody having an encounter and their dog possibly saving their life, and it reminded me of my own story with my pup. I rescued a pit bull from a neglectful family. She was skin and bones when she came home and extremely submissive. After a week of love, affection, and food, she was the most amazing dog I have ever met. The softest, cuddliest baby who wouldn't even play fight with me unless she was under a blanket and didn't know it was me. I needed to do a quick late-night run to my local shop. There's a 40-minute round-trip route on main roads with houses, or a 15-minute round-trip route through an alleyway that wraps around the back of a school field. This alleyway has no street lamps, but I hadn't ever heard of anything bad happening, so I didn't really think anything of it. So I set out with my dog in tow. Just before we reached the entrance, she stood still as a rock. I gently tried to usher her to follow me, but she refused. When I took my headphones off, I realized that she was softly growling and that I could hear a group of male voices coming from the alley. They soon came close enough to where I could see them, and I think that there was around 5 or 6 of them. This was during COVID, so they were all wearing masks with their hoods up. My mom always told me that if I found myself in a situation like this, to not act scared. Being scared shows that you're an easy target. With that in mind, I tugged firmly on my dog's lead to get her to follow me. She stuck to my side, literally pressing her body against my leg as I walked. She was quietly growling the whole time. The men had stopped and were standing slightly off the path to one side at this point. They were talking quietly amongst themselves as we walked by. I couldn't really hear much as my heartbeat was pounding in my ears and my gut was screaming at me. Once I knew I was at the point where the darkness of the alley made me essentially invisible, I heard one of them raise their voice slightly and said, "Nah, that's a pit." in a way that sounded like he was disagreeing. Now, they could have just been discussing the breed of my dog. That's a likely scenario. But the gut feeling I had while walking past and for the duration of my walk through the alley makes me believe otherwise. I think that these men were discussing possibly robbing me, or worse, and my soft baby, who was literally scared of her own reflection, deterred them due to being a quote aggressive breed. It's safe to say that we walked the long way home. So, creepy group of men, let's not meet again. I was chatting to a friend and I remember this creepy story from the pandemic. I, a female in my 30s, lived alone. I had no car and no shops nearby. It was around 9 p.m. and I got back from work and realized there was no food in the house, so I ordered a grocery delivery on Uber Eats. I asked them to leave it at the door due to the COVID rules. Later, there was a knock at my door and I saw a tall, skinny guy standing right by it. I shouted through the letterbox to leave it on the floor and back up. He said no and that he had to hand it to me because it had alcohol in it. I hadn't ordered any alcohol, so I told him that he had the wrong order. He claimed that it was correct. I told him sternly to put it on the floor and back up. Again, he refused. Stupidly, as I was tired, I opened the door a crack to tell him to do it due to the COVID rules, and he stepped toward the door and put his hand on the handle. I pulled it shut and shouted to tell him to leave or I was going to report him. He put it down and stepped back. I asked him through the letterbox to back up further. He did, but again when I opened the door he stepped forward. I now always remember the chill down my spine when he said, "Pretty, very pretty," in a low monotone. I noticed that he had his phone out pointed at me and asked what he was doing. He said he had to take a picture, but it was pointed at my face and not at the bag on the floor. I grabbed it and slammed the door shut and locked it. I watched through a crack in the curtains as he stood by the door, pacing back and forth as if he couldn't make up his mind. He knocked again, but I ignored it. I was getting seriously creepy vibes and called my best mate for advice. She told me to report him and not open the door. I shouted out the letterbox for him to leave, but he just stood there. My dog, who is normally the sweetest thing going, had picked up on my anxiety and began barking at the door. He turned and got into his car that was parked across the street from my house. I kept watching for the next 10 or so minutes through my window, but he wouldn't leave. He just sat there. But I figured maybe he was picking another order to take. Suddenly, a message popped up on Uber. He told me he'd forgotten a bag in the car and asked me to come get it. I checked my order and it was all there, so I messaged back saying it wasn't mine. He got insistent, saying he couldn't leave until I picked it up. He was practically begging me to come to the car, saying it wouldn't take a minute and that I could grab it from the passenger side. I lost my shit. I told him that I had heard what he had said, that I knew he was taking a pic of me and not the order, and that I was calling the police. He still said that I had to come get it. The entire time I was on the phone to the police, he was still messaging me, even saying, quote, "The police not come, pick up order and I leave. Why you making it hard?" The police told me someone would be there within 20 minutes and to stay inside with the doors locked. My dog was going nuts, with hackles up and barking. My neighbor's husband, who was 6'4" and built like a brick shed, texted saying he heard a commotion and asked if I was okay. I told him what was going on, and he immediately ran out, shouting at the guy that the driver was a predator and to, quote, "fuck off" before he got fucked up. The delivery guy then peeled out of there, and my neighbors came over to make me a brew and wait for the police. I made a report to both them and Uber, but all I got was an apology from Uber. The police never came back to me. I got a car shortly after and didn't use Uber again until my boyfriend moved in. So, to the creepy predatory Uber driver, let's not meet again. Recently I moved out of my apartment. I simply had to because I didn't feel safe with my landlords. I lived in this really nice Dumbo apartment in Brooklyn for a few months with my roommate, who paid for most of the rent since her parents are super rich. Our landlords were actually this seemingly really sweet couple who lived a few floors above with their kids. The first few weeks were somewhat normal, except for the fact that every time I saw their kids in the elevator, they would scream at me before they got off and then just run away. I thought it was funny and cute at first, but then their eldest son came to visit and started doing the same thing, and he looked to be about my age. I didn't really think much of it, since maybe he was just playing with his younger siblings. Shit got really weird when I bumped into all of them together and we talked for a bit. Out of nowhere, while we were having a pleasant conversation, the dad apologized to me, saying that his son might act strange because he's a I was pretty shocked with him just saying that out of the blue. I paused for a bit, and I can't really remember what I said, but I do remember just wanting to get the hell out of this conversation now. A few days later, I bump into the dad again in the elevator. I was pretty standoffish, and he was just talking about how great my apartment is and how much of a generous guy he is for giving it to us at such a low rate. Then he just asked if I could babysit his kids, as he and his wife and his eldest son would be at a dinner. I said no at first, but he counteroffered saying he'd pay $150 an hour, and being the greedy idiot that I am, I agreed. This is where I fucked up. When I get to his place, I was speechless. His apartment wrapped around the entire floor of the building. It was the nicest apartment that I'll ever see, that's for sure. About an hour in, everything was normal. I was playing some fighting game with the kids when we suddenly heard the front door slam. I told them to stay there as I peeked to see what was going on, and I see the dad just falling all over the place, clearly drunk as fuck. He started walking toward me and at the last minute fell face first onto the couch. I must have popped a blood vessel trying to hold in my laughter. I asked if he was okay though, and walked over to assist him. He then turned around, looked at me and said, "My wife will let us. Please." When I tried asking what he meant, his wife walked up to me, thanked me, paid me, and told me to come back another time. I just kinda went back to my apartment in shock, wondering what the fuck just happened, and I definitely wasn't going back. I told my roommate, and she told me that she also bumped into the dad, and he told her, quote, "My wife is cool, just so you know," with no explanation, and just left. At this point, we knew that we sure as hell were not going to renew our lease. We didn't see our landlords again until our final month. We kinda joked to our friends about how our landlords were creepy cucks. The next time I see them was actually with my boyfriend, who was well aware of what they were trying to do. It was an intensely awkward elevator ride, as when they saw us in there, they just went quiet and smiled and nodded at us repeatedly. As we step out of the elevator, the dad shouts "hey" to us and winks at me as the doors closed. After that, I asked my boyfriend to stay with us for the remainder of our lease, because at this point my roommate and I were freaked the fuck out. Our final and creepiest encounter was a few days before moving out. My roommate walked out of the apartment and both the landlords were sitting in front of the elevators waiting for us. She said that they started sobbing when they saw her and then begged us to stay. They apparently apologized for making us uncomfortable and said that they thought that we were the, quote, pretty young girls they were waiting for. She didn't say a word to them and got on the elevator and called me to warn me that they were outside, and then they started to knock. My boyfriend answered and said when the guy saw him, he asked if I was here. Of course, my boyfriend said no, but they tried walking in anyway. I walk out of my room saying I'll call the police if they don't leave, and they then beg me to not and run out of the apartment. A few days ago, we got a text from a random number saying we could live there for 6 months free if we just gave them a few nights. Of course, blocked and deleted. The whole thing was such an uncomfortable experience living there all those months, especially knowing they had the keys to our apartment. This happened a few years ago around mid-November. My mother and I love being outside and going for walks. This night in particular was freezing, but we decided we wanted to go out for a quick one anyway. As we walked back home, we went down this one street that we used all the time. It's a neighborhood street that leads to the main street, then back into our neighborhood again. We get halfway down the street when I hear a dog bark over the music of my phone. I turn it off and turn to look for the dog because I love dogs and I wasn't aware there was a big dog on the street. I spun around and saw a big dark mass just feet from me. If he stepped 2 more feet, he would have been able to grab me. I immediately felt weird and started speed walking back to my mom, who at that point didn't realize I had stopped. I turned off my phone and whispered to her that I thought that we were being followed. She turned around and grabbed my arm and told me that there was 2 men right behind us. We started walking in a zigzag pattern and sure enough, they followed our every step. Once they caught on that we knew, one of the dudes started to make small chit-chat with us. "Awfully late for y'all to be walking, huh?" I swear his voice sounded like the definition of the sirens' voices, luring sailors to their doom. He continued asking questions to us. My mom kept walking and replying with quick replies. From the sound of his voice, I knew we were in danger, so I went to dial 911. Instead, my mom told me to call my dad, as he would be able to get to us quicker because we were almost home. We got to the busy street and looked behind us to see them speed walking to us. We decided to risk it and ran into the middle of the street as cars passed on either side of us. We ran across again and met my dad on the other side. We looked back across the street and both men were gone. We got into the car and searched the streets, but these guys had disappeared into what seemed like thin air. I asked my mom if we would have been kidnapped if I hadn't heard the dog. She asked me, what dog? I asked her how she didn't hear this massive dog bark, especially with how good her hearing is. I still have no clue what it was that I heard, but I do know it most likely saved my life.